Dan Lothian, CNN, Washington.
Joining us now, Jeffrey Swartz. He's a former Miami-Dade County judge. He's a former prosecutor and a former defense attorney, now a professor of law at the Thomas M. Cooley School of Law in Tampa Bay. Judge Swartz, thanks very much for your time this time.
My pleasure to be here.
Take us inside the legislative thought process. Why have states like Florida enacted stand-your-ground laws?
Well, you cannot discount the effect of the National Rifle Association and all this. Florida was kind of a test ground. They spent a lot of money. They actually wrote the legislation and put it through a legislature that was overwhelmingly Republican. It was supported by then-Governor Jeb Bush. And in addition, you also, for just personality purposes, you have a very young Marco Rubio, who was the Republican leader in the State House and was at that time the Speaker-elect of the Florida legislature.
What was the solution that this was supposed to provide the remedy?
I think the phrase that's been used is this was a solution without a problem. The only problem that this law really was designed, or what really was behind it, was to reinstate what was known as the Castle Doctrine in the state of Florida. The law in Florida had evolved to the extent that even in your own home you had a duty to retreat as far as you possibly could before you could use deadly force. To that extent, the law reinstated the Castle Doctrine, and the idea that stand your ground is a singular law is really inaccurate. It is a series of legislative acts which are found in the Florida statutes, starting with Chapter 776, 012, and 013, and then two more statutes which were passed, which are 031 and 032. And they basically all together created what we call stand your ground.
Would we as a society, would Florida have been better served if they had created a Castle Doctrine more in league with what I think the average person would want, if the ability to do, you know, if their dwelling, their domicile, the place where they and their family live, if those laws were strengthened, but it didn't take it out into the community where I think the average person can plainly see confrontations or interactions between different individuals becoming needlessly violent, and because, as we all know, when there's death, there's no coming back from it. Injury, bad enough. With any luck, you heal, but there's no coming back from death. So, would they have been better served focusing on the castle notion, your home, your castle?
I believe that's accurate. In fact, the establishment of the Castle Doctrine, that is that under Florida law, you can use deadly force against anyone who is forcibly trying to enter your home or is actually within your home. That's the classic Castle Doctrine. And they reinstated that by one of those four statutes that I just cited to you. But they went further and tried to establish that your castle is any place where your feet are. And I'm not sure that that really served anybody's purposes. The classic self-defense theory did its job. It worked fine. And I didn't see a purpose in expanding it. A friend of mine, Dan Gelber, who was in the legislature at the time, commented that he thought this would return us to the days of the Old West. You know, the gunslingers in the street. And he wasn't inaccurate about that. So I agree that there was really no purpose. And, in fact, stand your ground has probably created more problems than it has solved.
Do you have a feel for where the public is now in terms of this law, where you live?
You know, it's hard to gauge in Florida. It depends on where you are. Florida is really three different places. It is the southeast area of the state, even parts of the southwest area of the state, which are generally made up of people who come from northern states, go down there to retire or relocate. Then you have the middle district, or the middle of the state, which is extremely right-wing. You have the I-4 corridor, which is very right-wing, religiously oriented. And then you have what amounts to be the northern portions of Florida, which are no different than being in Alabama, Mississippi, or Georgia.
What was your read? What was your take on the verdict? On the, I'm certain that you've been doing a lot of commenting on this case, helping the public understand the various issues, providing context, etc. As you watched with the rest of us Saturday night, the verdict read into that courtroom, what were your thoughts?
First of all, I wasn't surprised. I actually watched every minute of this trial. Where I was not available to watch it live, I had DVR'd it and watched every single minute of the trial. The state never had a cogent version of the events that took place. You cannot go to a jury and say that witnesses are lying without telling them what they're lying about and then tell them what really happened. And the state never did that. The case was terribly overcharged. It should have been brought in as a manslaughter case, seeking solely to determine whether excessive use of force was done by Mr. Zimmerman, as opposed to trying to defend Trayvon Martin or portray him as strictly just being a victim. The evidence made it, in my mind, abundantly clear that the actual physical violence was started by Mr. Martin, and that as a result of it, it escalated to the point where Mr. Martin was shot. If the state had come in there and conceded all of those facts and then just said George Zimmerman used too much force to repel non-deadly force, they would have had a chance of getting a conviction, but they refused to concede that point. The defense never had a bad day. Even when the state was putting on its case, it never had a bad day. And when you're a defendant, you know, bad things are supposed to happen to you while the state's putting on their case. Mm-hmm. That just never occurred. So I wasn't surprised by the verdict at all.
Do Trayvon's parents have the foundational elements for a civil case now against Mr. Zimmerman?
The foundational elements in Florida for a wrongful death suit, which would have to be done through the auspices of Trayvon's estate, and then they would be additional plaintiffs, is there just simply by the fact that there is no issue that Trayvon's death was caused by an act done by George Zimmerman. So they have a wrongful death claim. The question will come into play as to whether Mr. Zimmerman can now assert stand your ground in a civil case to obtain a dismissal or a summary judgment. And then the next issue would be if he does succeed in using stand your ground, he may be able to seek attorney's fees and costs against the estate and against Trayvon's parents. So it's a big risk for them. I don't think there are much in damages, money damages that can be assessed. They may file the civil suit just to get some determination that there's some fault on Mr. Zimmerman's part.
And what legitimate options, and by that, of course, I mean within the realities of the case and the confines of the law, etc., what about the Department of Justice? The Attorney General has spoken on the case. He's spoken before audiences that have applauded his words. But in terms of the real legal world, so to speak, what options does the U.S. Department of Justice have?
Well, I join in applauding Eric Holder's words. I think that he really, truly spoke from his heart. I think he believes in what he's saying. But part of what he's saying now and the things that you're hearing are really his way of saying, I feel your pain, I understand your pain, but he's not committing himself to a course of action for the Department of Justice because he's been around long enough, having served with Janet Reno, and now being the Attorney General himself, to understand that the possibilities of bringing any type of civil rights action against George Zimmerman are really negligible. They would have to be able to prove that at the time that George Zimmerman pulled the trigger, he pulled the trigger solely and for the only reason being that Trayvon Martin was African American. And they're just not going to be able to prove that in light of this verdict and the evidence that it would appear that the physical violence was started by Trayvon himself.
We only have a few seconds left. Do you have a broad feel for whether stand your ground laws are going to come under significant scrutiny now, and some states may express some buyer's remorse and tweak them or repeal them entirely? Or do you think the places that have them probably like them and will continue to have them?
I think we have the same effect on stand your ground laws that we saw in Washington with the move to try to put some restrictions on registration and use of firearms.